every morning, I walk down to the coffee shop with my 5-year-old, and we get coffee for Mommy before she wakes up. And he said, for me to miss that, this had better be good. and I don't mean good like entertaining and nice and fun, but I'm only here because I think I'm going to have an impact. And then I know that I'm here because you all are doing really important work. So I say that because I feel exactly the same way. I mean, Aman was joking that, we had to get you out of the house, but I know that it's not that easy to leave the house, right? I have 21-month-old twins, and I was at a conference this week, the Sustainable Brands Conference in San Diego, which is full of a lot of people doing important work inside big companies. I took a red-eye back last night and had just enough time to take a nap and say hi to my kids, and then they were waving bye-bye again. Right? So again, this isn't a boo-hoo me thing. Everybody's got important places to be, but we're not here to entertain. We're not here to talk to ourselves. We're not here to talk into the air. We're here because this is urgent, right? Because as I often said, that the crime, we've got to lift the economy up. Look at what was in the headlines this morning, right? GM, BP, another postmortem on the Deepwater Horizon disaster. This is a matter of life and death. So no pressure. But we're all here because we have a job to do. Okay, so that said, I'm going to do 3 things. Now, I'm going to share my story, which is the story of the book, which you all have, which is such a treat. It's still a little bit surreal to see that, but I'm glad you have it. I'm sharing my story, though, because it's not just my story. It's all of your stories. It's the story of what is it like to really do this work? What are the ups and downs of trying to make big business work in our best interest, whether you work in or with big companies or against them sometimes, or if you're in academia studying them, we all have the same goal. So this is our story. So I'm going to walk through that, and then to show that it's not just my story, I interviewed about 3 dozen other people, mostly people inside companies doing this work, but also some of the advocates and activists and academics and experts I've gotten to know over the years. So I'll share with you a couple of the themes that emerged from those interviews, which again are in the book. And then I'll share with you a couple thoughts about kind of the state of play of business sustainability and where I think we're going and where we need to go next. Sound good? Okay, good. All right, so my story. So I joined BP right after I finished business school. Newly minted MBA, idealistic, and convinced that business was a force for good in the world, and that I was going to change the world. And I joined BP, which at the time made sense, because it was run by a guy named John Brown. And he had recently become the first head of a major energy company to acknowledge the realities of climate change and urge action. So I saw what everybody else saw at the time. This was a different kind of oil man trying to create a different kind of energy company. And he was equally progressive and outspoken on human rights. So I joined the company, went out to Indonesia, and I actually saw those aspirations come to life. I ended up focusing on a liquefied natural gas plant that BP was building. And technically, economically, this was not a big deal. There was a nice, big, fat, juicy gas field that sat in a bay, pretty close to the surface, easy to extract. BP was going to build an onshore liquefied natural gas and LNG processing plant to develop that asset and send the gas all over the Pacific Rim. And technically, that's a pretty straightforward thing to do. BP's done that all over the world, but never in a place like West Papua. Anybody been to West Papua? Yeah, it's at the end of the earth. So, I mean, to get there at the time, it's gotten a little bit easier, but I had to take an overnight commercial flight from Jakarta, and then take a small seaplane, and then take a helicopter the rest of the way to the site. So, an eye-opener. I mean, I understood conceptually what the company did, right? Like, we keep the lights on, we keep the cars moving. But it was going out there, and it was that last stretch on the helicopter. And so West Papua, again, it's at the eastern tip of Indonesia. It's the west half of the island that Papua New Guinea is. And it's, you know, environmentally, it's a treasure trove. It's got a percentage of the world's flora and fauna species that far outweigh, you know, the percentage of land mass. So on that last stretch, it's just really dense rainforest and you know, flocks of birds bursting through the trees, and very little sign of human settlement. And then as the helicopter was coming in, I could just make out the exploration rig on the horizon line of the bay. And you know, it's on the equator, and so as we're going in, I'm looking down at this scene, and I could make out the helicopter landing pad and the barracks, and I started to get really hot and sweaty, and I'd never been in a helicopter before, and I was exhausted, so it was all a little bit, you know, nerve-wracking. And I took a swig of water, and I realized that my discomfort was actually not just physical, that I was looking at this scene below me and imagining the sketches of what this plant would look like, you know, a big silver gleaming modern industrial complex, and imposing it on the scene below me. And it was actually the first time that I thought, oh, this is what we do. And I started to get pretty uncomfortable. But luckily I was there bringing some other senior executives from BP from around the company who worked on environmental and social issues and challenges. And so as soon as you can't really talk in the helicopter, but as soon as we got out, I was standing next to this woman who was one of the vice presidents for environmental policy at BP. And she saw the distress on my face, and she said, that's exactly why we're here. We're going to get this right. So what was so interesting about that project was that the challenges were massive, right? So we were going to have to resettle a village of 127 households to make way for this plant. We were going to have to work with the Indonesian military, which is not known for their good community relations. We were going to have to work in this very sensitive environment. And there were lots of examples nearby of big projects where the company had not paid attention to these issues, and things had gone horribly wrong for local people and for the company. So in the same province was the Freeport-McMoRan Grasberg copper and gold mine, one of the largest in the world. And they've had decades of social strife because the company went in and struck a deal with the national government and thought, well, that's all we need to do. And they spent something like $26 million on security a year for that mine, which is a lot of money, right? So people understood that we had to invest, we had to engage, we had to consult. So that became my job there. As I spent a couple of years working on that project, bringing in, you know, we hired the World Bank's top expert on resettlement, the guy who literally wrote the book, to advise us on how to do that to international standards, which went well beyond Indonesian law. And commissioned the first ever human rights impact assessment for a private sector project, partnered with NGOs, liaison officers, to help us make sure that there were open lines of communication with the local communities. It was a fascinating project. And remember, this is my first job out of business school, right? So I get there and like, everybody gets it. And I've got budget, and I've got money, and I've got support. And I was like, I love big oil. This is awesome. Big business is great. Everybody gets it. This is fantastic. And then I went to China, and I actually had a similar experience there. So my next assignment was on this big chemicals plant. And it was a 50-50 joint venture between BP and Sinopec, one of China's state-owned energy companies. And we were going to be bringing in a migrant construction workforce of about 20,000 men into a town of about 30,000 people. So that could be a little bit disruptive. So I commissioned a social impact assessment, which was partly for the report, but actually not really for the report. It was a way to engage with local party officials, and even most difficult, the biggest challenge there actually was to engage with our joint venture partners and to convince them that we had to pay attention to the welfare of the migrant workers. I'll share with you one story. The first week that I got there, I was sitting in a meeting, and it was half BP guys, half Sinopec guys, all guys, going down the spreadsheet with the latest estimates for the cost and the timeline for the project. And we're going down the spreadsheet, and one of the labels, the whole thing hadn't yet been translated into English, so we got to a line, and the number was 8. The label was in Mandarin. And my BP colleague said, what's this number 8, what's the label? And one of the Sinopec guys said, oh, that's the projected number of fatalities. He said, excuse me? And he said, yeah, on a project with this many man-hours, a project this big, workforce this size, we'd expect about 8 fatalities. And my colleague said, the target is not 8. The target is 0. And the Sinopec guy said, well, that's not realistic. And at first, of course, I was horrified. And then I realized, you know what, he's right. Based on their track record, they would expect about 8 fatalities. So this was the kind of conversation that I was stepping into. We managed not to kill anybody on the site during construction, hurrah. But again, I was there and I had license to be there because this was a big, important project for the company with a really important joint venture partner. So again, I had a lot of support and backing from BP senior management to push, right, to get this right. Then I went back to London to BP headquarters, and I was working with colleagues around the world who were working in difficult places to try to create an internal network for the first time. We realized everybody was sort of reinventing the wheel, not learning from our challenges. And so to get everybody together to articulate a human rights guidance note, a sort of policy statement to help people internally as well as externally communicate, okay, what does human rights mean to BP? What different functions have different accountabilities for different human rights issues? So again, I'm working with colleagues around the world who understand the importance of human rights and want to get it right. I love big oil.